So let's do some hands-on. So what I'll do is that I'll create a work group called lookup queries, and I'll limit the data scan to 5 GB and execute a complex query. Then I'll create a second work group and I'll name it as ad hoc analytics and limit the data scan to 500 GB and execute the same query again. And then finally, I'll use a capacity reservation with 25 DPUs and attach them to the second work group, and I'll run some queries and check the CloudWatch metrics. Okay, so this is my Athena console and this is the particular dashboard, and here if I look at the tabs, we have a tab called work group under administrations. So here we can create work groups. So click on work group and here you'll see there's a default work group which is called primary work group, and all the queries that we have been running so far were using the primary work group. So if I open the query editor, so as you can see, the query that I was running was in primary work group, and this is where we can see the work group. And if I click here, of course, there are no other work groups. So by default, whenever we run any query, without creating a work group, it uses the primary work group. And if I click on this particular work group, it tells us the settings for that work group, and per query data usage, there's no data limit, of course, because it is the primary work group and we can run any type of queries, and by default there's no data limit for that work group. And we can turn off this work group and we can delete this also. Now let me go ahead and create a new work group and I'll name it as lookup queries work group. So you can give some description here, and this is where we talk about we mention the query engine or the analytics engine. We can use Athena SQL, which is basically Trino, or we can use Apache Spark also. And when you select Athena SQL, it gives you the option of upgrade query engine. It can be either automatic or manual. And then we have additional configurations, and this is the authentication layer, and we can use AWS Identity and Access Management or IAM Identity Center for authentication. Now, as I have logged in using the root account, so I should not have any problem, but I can create a user and give that user permission to use this particular work group. So this is related to IAM users and roles or groups also. So we mentioned that I want to use AWS Identity and Access Management, and then I'll have to create an IAM user or IAM role and give that user or role permission to use this particular work group that I am creating. Then we have the query result option. So this is basically the output, and this is what we had selected while running the query for the first time. And I'll select the same bucket, 3IAM Athena output bucket. Then you have some optional settings. Here it tells you to publish the query metrics to AWS CloudWatch, and that is what we should do. There are some other options like override client-side settings. So what are these client-side settings? So if you are using APIs or JDBC or ODBC drivers, there can be some configuration which can be set at the client side. So if I mention override client-side settings, what would happen? Whatever configuration I have done in this particular work group, those will be given priority. Then there's something called queries for requester pays buckets in S3, and I have already told you what requester pays bucket is, because we'll be reading data from S3. So if the bucket is for someone else, and let's say you are using your own bucket and you do not want to pay for the download of result sets, then you can use requester pays buckets. And then we have per query data usage control, and here we mention the data limit. Now as per our requirement, the data limit should be 5 GB, so I can change it to 5 and then gigabytes or GB. If I mention no data limit, there won't be any limits as such. Then after that, we can have data usage alerts. We can add alert here, meaning that, so we have set up as 5 GB. Let's say whenever it reaches to 3 GB or the data usage reaches to 3 GB for a particular time period, it can be 1 day, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 6 hours, etc. If the data usage goes beyond 3 GB, we can use an SNS topic to send an email or message or something. I will not use it anyway. And then we have tags, and I'll just add one tag, rather two tags, an environment archive lookup. Let's say that is the environment name. Then let me go ahead and create this workgroup. So the workgroup has been created. So a primary and lookup queries workgroup. Let me create one more for ad hoc analytics. I'll name it as ad hoc analytics workgroup. I'll use Athena SQL. Authentication would remain the same. The query output would also remain the same. I'm not going to change it. And then I'll publish the query matrix to AWS CloudWatch. And here I'll set a limit of 500 GB because this workgroup might be running pretty big SQL statements. No data usage alert, and let me add two tags. Name ad hoc analytics workgroup and environment ad hoc analytics. So if I go to the workgroups list, I have these three workgroups. Of course, I can edit these workgroups also. So let's say I select this workgroup and then I can edit and change a few of the things, like I can change the authentication, I can change the query result configuration, I can change the override client side settings, CloudWatch settings, etc. I can change the data usage limit also, and it tells you the average data scanned per query. It gives you this particular information also, and based on that I can change it. Similarly, I can change and workgroup data usage alerts also. Anyway, I'll not do anything. So now let me go ahead and run some queries. Now to run queries, I'll use 3IAM Athena database, and I have created 6 tables: customers CSV, customers Parquet, orders CSV, orders Parquet, sellers CSV, and sellers Parquet. What will I do is that I will go ahead and execute some join queries using this particular workgroup, and the size is approximately 10 GB, 8 GB, something like that, of these tables. So now what will I do? I will execute this particular query wherein I'm selecting data from order CSV and customer CSV based on customer ID. Now I'll have to change the workgroup. So here the workgroup was primary, and I'll have to refresh to see the new workgroups that I have created. And the moment I refresh, I can see the workgroups that are available. So I have ad hoc analytics workgroup and lookup queries workgroup. So let me go ahead and select lookup queries workgroup, and here I can submit this particular query. And if the query takes or scans more than 5 GB of data, it will be cancelled. This is not a lookup query, by the way. This is basically an analytics query wherein I'm joining two tables and both are in CSV. So let me execute this. So it gives you this error: byte scanned limit was exceeded, because I had mentioned the limit of 5 GB. Now what will I do is that I'll execute another query. Let's say select customer ID, customer name, and maybe email. Parquet file where customer ID equal to some value. So what it should do is that if the amount of records scanned is less than 5 GB, then it should execute. So let's see. Okay, so it got executed. As you can see, the data scanned was much less, which is 186 MB, and I can see two different customer IDs. I mean, two different values with the same customer ID. So that's why in the same lookup queries workgroup, I was able to execute this query because the data scan did not breach the 5 GB limit. Now what will I do is I'll change this workgroup to ad hoc analytics workgroup. So in this case, what I should do, I should run the exact same query that I was running earlier, which is this one. I'm joining orders underscore CSV and customers underscore CSV table. So now it should not give me any error, even though it crosses 5 GB of data scan limit, because in this particular work group I have mentioned that the data scan limit is 500 GB, and it has scanned 17 GB, and now it is preparing the output and showing the output in this console. That's why it is taking so much of time, even though the data scan is complete. So 17 GB was pretty less, so I should be able to see some output now. It might take quite some time for the output to come here, But what will I do is that I will place some limit values and then execute it again. So what limit would do, it would again scan 17 GB of table, and it will show me the output only 1000 rows. So if you see, the result is 1000 rows. So the data scan is again similar, so it is only 17.05 GB, but as I was allowed to execute this query because in this particular work group I had set a limit of 500 GB. Okay, so now how do you see the matrix in workgroup? What we do is that we can go to, let's say, this particular workgroup, and here at the bottom we have data usage controls, tags, and matrix. So if you click on matrix, it will show some CloudWatch matrix. While creating the workgroup, I mentioned that publish data to CloudWatch matrix. So that's why it is showing me some matrix. So currently data is not available. It will take some time. It will tell you the total execution time, the total data scanned, total succeeded queries, and total failed queries. These are the only queries that will, or sorry, only matrix that will be shown here, because again, there's no capacity reservation, there's no DPU, etc. So this is how workgroup works. Now what will I do is that I'll create a capacity reservation and attach that capacity reservation with the analytics workgroup, and then look at the matrix again.